Now, the other big fight during the debate was between Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Buttigieg. Tulsi was the one who started this. She went after Mayor Pete for his recent remarks on sending troops to Mexico. They had a pretty good exchange. It went back and forth a bit.
But I want to get back to Pete Buttigieg and his comment about experience. Pete, you'll agree that the service that we both have provided to our country as veterans by itself does not qualify us to serve as commander-in-chief. I think the most recent example of your inexperience in national security and foreign policy came from your recent careless statement about how you as president would be willing to send our troops to Mexico to fight the cartels. As commander-in-chief, leader of our armed forces, I bring extensive experience serving for 7 years in Congress, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, on the Homeland Security Committee, meeting with leaders of countries around the world, working with military commanders of different commands, dealing with high-level national security briefings, understanding what's necessary, the preparation that I've gotten to walk in on day one to serve as Commander-in-Chief.
Congresswoman, thank you. Mr. Mayor, I'll allow you to respond.
I know that it's par for the course in Washington to take remarks out of context, but that is outlandish even by the standards of today's politics.
Are you saying that you didn't say that?
I was talking about U.S.-Mexico cooperation. We've been doing security cooperation with Mexico for years, with law enforcement cooperation and a military relationship that could continue to be developed with training relationships, for example. Do you seriously think anybody on this stage is proposing invading Mexico?
That's not what I said.
I'm talking about building up alliances. And if your question is about experience, let's also talk about judgment. One of the foreign leaders you mentioned meeting was Bashar al-Assad. I have, in my experience, such as it is, whether you think it counts or not, since it wasn't accumulated in Washington, enough judgment that I would not have sat down with a murderous dictator like that.
Congresswoman Gabbard, let me allow you to respond.
Thank you. You were asked directly whether you would send our troops to Mexico to fight cartels, and your answer was yes. The fact checkers can check this out. No. But your point about judgment is absolutely correct. Our commander-in-chief does need to have good judgment. And what you've just pointed out is that you would lack the courage to meet with both adversaries and friends to ensure the peace and national security of our nation. I take the example of those leaders who have come before us, leaders like JFK, who met with Khrushchev, like Roosevelt, who met with Stalin,
like Donald Trump,
Reagan, who met and worked with Gorbachev. These issues of national security are incredibly important. I will meet with and do what is necessary to make sure that no more of our brothers and sisters in uniform are needlessly sent into harm's way fighting regime change wars that undermine our national security. I'll bring real leadership and experience to the White House.
I've got to respond.
Senator Sanders, I'm going to have a response.
Now, folks, I can't quickly get into Pete Buttigieg's background. It's very complicated and very strange. His parents were professors at the University of Notre Dame. His father was actually a well-known left-wing intellectual. But Pete went to Harvard and Oxford. He was actually one of the first few hundred people on Facebook. And he recently was actually propped up by Mark Zuckerberg, appearing in some photos together. He worked at some different think tanks and also McKinsey. He was in Navy intelligence and went to Afghanistan. And then after that, he went back to South Bend, Indiana, where he was raised, where he has served as mayor for the past few years. Now, folks, I don't know how many of you actually have ever been to South Bend, Indiana, but it is a deeply troubled city. Prior to the 1960s, it was home to the famous car, the Studebaker. But when the Studebaker went out of business, South Bend, Indiana really suffered. They've been dealing with poverty for decades. But because South Bend is also the home to the University of Notre Dame, it's a very, very stratified city. There's many wealthy families who live around the university, yet much of the city suffers from deep poverty. There's also a lot of problems with infrastructure. The roads in South Bend are absolutely terrible. And there's also problems with the police force and with institutional racism in the city. This has come up recently when South Bend Councilman Oliver Davis, who is the longest serving African American man on the city's Common Council, endorsed Joe Biden over Pete Buttigieg, which is really big news, especially if you think about how important it might be for South Bend to have its mayor become president of the United States. And after that, Michael Harriot wrote a scathing piece in The Root called "Pete Buttigieg is a lying MF." This article centers primarily on a 2011 television piece featuring Pete Buttigieg, where he said that kids from lower-income minority neighborhoods don't have someone they know personally who testifies to the value of education. This is further complicated by a tweet that Pete Buttigieg put out about the same time, where he tweeted out a story about the Springfield, Massachusetts police using Green Beret tactics. In the tweet, Pete Buttigieg said, quote, "Interesting use of counterinsurgency tactics to address gang violence. Dovetails with community policing strategy," end quote. All of this is to say, of course, that Pete Buttigieg does not really have a record to run on. It's a very strange situation where he's being propped up as the future of the Democratic Party, but he doesn't really seem to have much of a record. One has to wonder what kind of ties he might have that are helping boost him in the race, as he really does seem like the ultimate AstroTurf candidate.